Man, watch out when James says amen. Things break loose. How many of you remember the old CBS television series, Hawaii Five-0, by which I do mean the original one? Yeah, they ran from like 1968 to 1980, something like that. I believe the lead character was Detective Steve McGarrett, headed up kind of a special division of the state police tasked with bringing down organized crime on the Hawaiian Islands. The show itself ran for some 12 seasons, so apparently even television can't put a dent in organized crime. I found myself thinking about this past week because almost every episode had this famous line that the lead detective would end with. He'd look at his partner, Dan Williams, and he'd say, "Book 'em, Danno." And if you were really lucky and it was like a murder in the first degree episode or homicide, he would look at his partner like the clip just had, and he would short form it. He'd say, "Book 'em, Danno. Murder one." And as a kid, I would watch this, and part of me would just go, yeah, it's like justice is done. And part of you always listened to that line and went, oh man, and there's something ominous when it comes to the subject of murder. Like when you start to put kind of like crime onto some kind of like a scale, it's hard to get away from that feeling like kind of the big one that's just, it doesn't get worse than this. And we come to a bit of a hinge and swing point in the Sermon on the Mount. This is the journey that we've begun this fall. And as Jesus begins to transition from beatitudes, kingdom characteristics, to do attitudes, kingdom behavior, we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But as he switches that, he takes no time to warm his audience up. This is literally where he jumps in. Murder one. So it's Thanksgiving at, West Portal. Welcome to Homicide Sunday. I want to take a bit of time to put things in context. We're walking through this series unapologetically, and I think there's some really good stuff, and I will bridge a little bit at the end as to why I think this is also not an inappropriate subject, as odd as it will seem, for a Thanksgiving Sunday. The gospel is a name, Jesus, and it is a great fact or announcement that in him, history has reached a crisis point. The time is fulfilled. In Jesus, God's new order is breaking into the world. In Jesus, the blessings of the future are beginning to spill over into the present. In Jesus, the kingdom of heaven has begun to invade earth. The time is fulfilled. The kingdom of God is near. And when this great news and great fact grabs a hold of an individual or of a community or of a nation, things start to happen. And what starts to happen is a description of what the Sermon on the Mount is, of the transformation that begins to take place. Inside people, new character traits, new habits, new passions, new lifestyles, a new value system, and it spills over through our lives, and it influences and impacts those around us, which is where we were last Sunday, looking at the metaphor or the images of salt and light, that you and I are to be a glimpse of and a taste of the good news of Jesus in the world around us. And church is one of the few places where when we say stay salty, we mean that differently than you're used to hearing it. This brings us to the hinge of the Sermon on the Mount, and it's worth retracing a little bit of our steps just so that we keep the context of this in mind. The hinge of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. Instead, I've come to fulfill them." And then he goes on to say, "Unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you certainly are not going to inherit the kingdom of God." After Jesus has finished preaching his down is up, kingdom characteristics, what we call the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, the gentle, the merciful, the pure in heart, and so on. It would not be unlikely that his audience is forced to the question, is anything else that we've heard up to this point still valid? Or should we throw our Old Testament out and we'll just move forward with Jesus, who's clearly on about a new thing? And that's actually somewhat popular because Jesus seems much more likable than the grumpiness of the God of the Old Testament. That's a subject for another day. But Jesus clarifies. He says, no. We're not going to do away with the past. I've not come to abolish the law or the prophets. By the way, little side note, the Jewish scriptures are divided into kind of three primary types or categories of literature: the law, the prophets, and the writings, some of the wisdom literature. If you wanted to a short form way of speaking of all of it, you would say the law and the prophets, which is precisely what we find Jesus doing. So he is affirming what has come before. I've not come to abolish this. I've come to fulfill it. So we're going to move from kingdom character to kingdom behavior. In fact, I'll suggest that starting this Sunday and then over the course of the next few, the short passages that we come to are a little like YouTube short videos. And you go like, this is what kingdom behavior looks like in different situations and or relational settings. Now, Jesus says, I've come to fulfill the law. What does he mean by this? And we talked, James laid the foundation last week. I'll just retrace. In one sense, Jesus is quite simply the literal fulfillment to which the Old Testament was always pointing. On a second level, Jesus is the only person to ever have come and lived out perfect obedience to the Father. In that sense, Jesus has fulfilled the law. For our purposes, however, and on a more practical level, Jesus has come to fulfill, to fill full the heart and the intent that was always behind the law that God gave. Here's where, actually, Heather, can you jump with me and give me the next slide? Yes. This was the image we used last week. If the solid line gives an indication of the given law itself, Jesus is about to fill full the arc, or color in the circle of what God's heart always was behind this. Now, you can leave that up. Let me give you a practical example. It's a silly example, but it is practical. How many of you have ever been on a road trip with squabbling children in the back seat? And it's unfortunate because my parents are actually here this morning. How many of you have ever been a squabbling child in the back seat? Okay, so we've got just about everybody on the hook for this. Kids are wonderful, and they have a way of both getting under each other's skin and on each other's nerves, and backseat squabbles can happen for a variety of reasons, but inevitably it involves poking and touching and sitting too close and whatever else. And as the volume and the squabble escalates in the back seat, so does the indignation and frustration of those in the front seat, until someone eventually, whoever usually has the shortest temper, turns around and finally barks out, "Don't touch each other," which, by the way, is a law. That's a rule, if you will. And this is usually followed by about 60 seconds of sulky silence, after which one of the children gets a bit of a mischievous grin on their face. You know where I'm going with this. Turns to their sibling and does this, and holds their finger millimeters from the head, which really should bother us less than it does. But if you've ever been on the receiving end of this, for some reason, it is surprisingly irritating. And the squabble escalates all over again in the back seat until one of the parents in the front finally turns around and barks out once again, "Cut that out!" At which point, the child with their finger turns with a self-righteous expression to mom and dad and says what? "I'm not touching them." Okay, so you know this, you know what I'm talking. This is the shortcoming of a law or a rule. Most of them are so specific and to like a certain behavior that it fails to color in the intent behind the rule. And what you and I discover is that it is really quite possible to keep the letter of the law, "I'm not touching," while 100% violating the spirit or the heart behind the law, which is honor, respect, don't provoke the person that you're sitting beside. This is what Jesus has come to do. He is taking a law that God has given. It's a specific law, and he is filling it full. He is painting a picture of what God's heart always was behind the rule. Does that make sense? Matthew chapter 5 is where we are going. If you have your Bibles, Matthew 5, 21 to 26, it's not a long passage. So tell you what, let me read this, and we'll talk a little bit about it. "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'Do not murder.' and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to his brother, Raka, is answerable to the Sanhedrin. But anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still with him on the way, or he may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. I tell you the truth, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. All right. So Jesus begins this kind of section, kingdom behavior, by highlighting the sixth of the famous 10 commandments of your Old Testament. You find this in Exodus chapter 20. Thou shalt not kill. If you learned this in the King's English, the word means, you and I would call this homicide today. This is what Hawaii 5.0 would call murder 1. Now, I don't know about you, when I find myself reading through the 10 commandments, I've come to the conclusion this is one of my favorites. Which is odd. I can see you raising eyebrows. Here's the reason. Because the 10 commandments are hard to keep. And I always get to the sixth, and I feel good about myself. Have I killed anyone today? Hey, it's early, but I'm cautiously optimistic, right? And so I read through this, and if you ever had like a to-do list, it's always nice to knock one or two things out right at the beginning. You feel good about yourself. This is my feel-good moment of the 10 commandments. Hey, didn't kill anybody. One down, 9 to go. And as we are about to see, by the way, this is how the Jewish religious leaders would have also defined this law. Is homicide. Did you kill anybody? No? Check. And Jesus is about to come, and he's about to fill this law full, which, as you and I are about to discover, is a little uncomfortable in the breadth of what it includes. Attitudes and hurtful words and behaviors that provoke and things like that. I found an author this past week that walked through the passage just with a few observations, and I found that helpful, so I'm going to share it similarly. Here are 5 observations. But I tell you that anyone who is angry. Might interest you to know there are 2 Greek words for anger. One that means quickly provoked, and one that means long nurtured. It is the second one that Jesus chooses to use here. I believe the root word is orge, and it means a slow swelling or a long-held kind of opposition towards someone. So Jesus seems to be suggesting let's be clear. A moment of anger is probably no less wrong, but we also somehow understand it's obviously wrong. What Jesus seems to be drawing out here is that long, slow burn that sometimes we hold on into the heart, while far less obvious, is no less wrong. Some words, and anger is maybe misleading in this way. We don't tend to use the word that way. I thought words like resentment, bitterness, indignation would all be words that we would use to capture that idea of nursing something in our hearts. Second observation, anyone who says to his brother, Raka. Any of you borrowed that one, by the way, this morning yet? You can file that away for future reference. The word has Aramaic origins, and our best guess for translation is that it means empty-headed. By the way, for fans of the 1960s comedy Hogan's Heroes, which took place in the German POW camp, there's a German word that's really close to this. Some of you know what's coming. Dummkopf. And you can practice that with me. 1, 2, 3. It just feels good coming off of the palate. And it means quite literally dumb head. Right? The idea behind this seems to be we are calling into question someone's mental faculties. That they don't have it all together. Words that we might use, you are so stupid. You idiot. Kind of capture this idea, not all up here. Third observation, and this is the third example Jesus uses, but anyone who says, you fool. More, case form of the Greek word, would you call it moros or moros, James? Moros. If that sounds vaguely familiar, by the way, that is where we get our English word moron from. Isn't that wonderful? There's some dispute as to the specific nature of these 2 derogatory terms, but it seems that the most likely answer is that the first calls into question someone's kind of mental faculties. The second one undermines their whole character. We would say something like, you good for nothing. Something that speaks to the totality of who somebody is. By the way, derogatory words are probably always hurtful to us. Despite the famous sticks and stones expression that we grow up with, they really do actually wound. This would be particularly wounding, damaging, felt in a first century Jewish context where a person's identity was considered so closely joined and connected with the meaning of your name. You and I don't carry that same kind of sense of identity. Like, for us to take something that personal, we kind of have to get into, like, your mama kind of territory, where at some point it's more for Southern, Americans. But once you start to insult somebody's mother, like that's where we start to take personal offense. This is the kind of the idea behind this insult. We've moved to something deep. Fourth observation. Yeah, there seems to be, it's not overt, but I will suggest to you there is a subtle escalation, both in the nature of the insult, right? Nurtured anger, nurtured resentment eventually gives way to kind of biting, sarcastic remarks, which lead to a more public, undermining insult or assault to somebody's character. The prospective punishments that Jesus associates with them also feels like there's kind of an escalation that goes along with this. So it starts, but anyone who is, I tell you, anyone who is angry, anyone who's nursing this, is also subject to judgment. Let's be clear, we're not talking about a human justice system. There isn't a court in the world that's going to convict somebody for being angry. Our entire planet would need to be locked up. So Jesus seems to be suggesting nursed anger, holding on to bitterness and resentment, puts you and I on God's radar screen. He says, I see that. And by the way, that's not in a good way in this case. I see that. Then he goes on to say, right, like, you say to some of your brother, like, you idiot, answerable to the Sanhedrin. Now we're talking about a human justice system. I might say it this way. Defamation of character, you and I know, can put you legally on the hook for damages. Sometimes there are affronts that we do with those around us that have human consequences, and this is more than just being put on somebody's radar screen. And then, of course, he kind of finishes with the granddaddy, no offense to granddads, but I tell you, anyone who says you fool will be in danger of the fires of hell, final or ultimate punishment. A little side note in case you're curious, it's a Greek translation or transliteration of a Hebrew expression, I think it's Gehinnom, and it means literally the valley of the sons of Hinnom. Will be in danger of the valley of the sons of Hinnom. And if that goes to you, join the club. Here's why. If you go back into your Old Testament, there's a handful of not very godly kings, and this particular valley, which is southwest of Jerusalem, became a popular site for pagan worship and was noted for really detestable things, including child sacrifice. King Josiah, one of the good kings, gets it right, and he destroys the pagan worship site, and he desecrates the valley in hopes that it will never be kind of rebuilt, and the valley is eventually converted into the garbage dump for Jerusalem. This is where garbage would be taken out from the city and burned. So it is a place of refuge, it's stinky, it's always smoldering, and Jewish apocalyptic writers over kind of the course of time started to pick this up as an image, as a way of talking about final judgment. So they would describe it first as the entrance to hell, and then as time passed, it became kind of synonymous with hell itself. So Jesus picks up an image that is known to his audience and says, just want you guys to know, this kind of stuff puts you in danger of final or ultimate punishment. Lastly, Jesus is drawing out the ark. He is filling it full for this sixth commandment, do not murder. And Jesus is not saying that biting sarcasm or hurtful words are murder. He's not equating them. But in the broad arc of God's heart behind this law, which I will suggest to you has to do with the wholeness and the vibrancy and the well-being of relationships, this is included in undermining this. And so nursing anger is damaging to relationships, and it is displeasing to God. It is in violation of the heart of God that was always behind this particular rule. And Jesus does not offer a short course on anger management. There's no like 10 steps to de-escalate a situation or what an adult-sized timeout looks like. Instead, he just offers 2 illustrations, and they're really kind of straightforward. The first says, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go be reconciled to your brother, then come offer your gift. So just first observation, we should notice this appears to be what you and I might call an in-house conflict. The word brother can mean literal blood relative. It would also be a word often used in the New Testament to speak of a brother or sister in Christ. If we take the opening couple verses of the Sermon on the Mount as context, where it says Jesus gathers his disciples to him and he teaches them saying, we understand there's a crowd present, but this feels like Jesus looking at his followers saying, if you remember that a brother has something against you, here's your response. Now, Jesus' example is drawn from Jewish worship, which often involved traveling to the temple to offer sacrifices and so on. We could put this in contemporary language. If you find yourself in the midst of a worship service, like we are this morning, and while you are having a great time with your eyes closed and your hands raised between you and God, the Spirit nudges in your heart that someone that you know, a brother or sister, has a grievance against you, stop singing. Put your Bible down, walk out of the service, go make things right, then come back and worship. To which we say, like, really, it couldn't wait 45 minutes? The service will be over by then. By the way, if you read this example, let me give you a quick geography reminder. The example Jesus uses is even more ridiculous than that. Like, it borders on comical. Jesus is preaching in Galilee. This sermon is taking place in northern Israel, which is several days' journey from the temple. If you are there offering your gift and remember that somebody has a grievance against you, stop what you're doing, go make things right. It could take weeks. It sounds like Jesus has some urgency in mind with this. I'll offer a disclaimer on this a little bit later as we head to application. That's example number 1. Example number 2, settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still on the way. We're switching. It's no longer with a brother or sister. This is not somebody you are on great terms with. Adversary, enemy, there's hostility here. All right? And we're not given the specifics of the situation, which is probably fine. It sounds like there's an unpaid debt. The heartbeat of this illustration is simple. Settle matters quickly. By the way, because this was interesting to me, did you know that the Greek expression that has been translated settle matters quickly literally reads, make friends quickly? Is Jesus hinting that the kind of reconciliation, the kind of restored relationships that you and I are to pursue should go beyond just the paying of a debt or the making amends for wrongs and damages, but should be the kind of reconciliation that has the potential to make friends out of enemies? Anybody else feel like it's like, I don't have it in me to be this kind of a person? I won't ask for a show of hands. That's where we go back to that first beatitude. Blessed are those who are reminded. We won't do this, left to our own devices. Has to be God's transformative work in our hearts and lives. Application. What do we do with this? Let me give you 3 ideas. How many of you are familiar with Proverbs 4:23? Above all else, guard your heart because it is the wellspring of life. What gets nurtured and nursed in the heart, good or bad, by the way, tends to bubble up through the mouth, and it tends to spring out through our actions and our behaviors. Guard your heart, because this is where resentment and bitterness and indignation are nursed. I was part of, let me back up for a minute. One of the great things about the way God seems to have wired us is that when we are not rightly related with others, almost always you and I can sense it. It's palpable. It can be everything from like a subtle twinge of conscience. Man, I think there's something off. It can involve crippling shame, crippling guilt, all sorts of things. But I was part of a freedom session teaching time a few weeks ago, and Ken Dick, who was here, by the way, at the end of August, had this wonderful line. I'm going to share it with you. You're welcome. He said, pain is God's megaphone. Pain is God's megaphone in your and my life. You don't have to like it any more than I do, but you and I can sense when something is off in our relationship, and this is our opportunity to pay attention. This is God's version of going, hey, listen up. We've got to talk. And on this subject, by the way, do you remember how far into your biblical story it takes for the very first homicide to take place? Yeah, we're not multiple books or chapters in. It's 4. Here's the short form of the story. 2 brothers, Abel, Cain. Abel brings an offering that is pleasing to God. Cain does not. God is displeased with Cain, and what we read in Genesis 4, verse 5, because Cain can feel the pain of not being rightly related to God. It says, so Cain was very angry. But I say to you, anyone who is, this is God's opportunity. If you take the story at face value, and I'll presume to here, God comes and has a short conversation with Cain. Here's a paraphrase. Buddy, you are feeling the disconnect. But this is not irreparable. You just need to course correct, and this relationship can be restored. Act differently, and we're good. But Cain does not. He nurses and he nurtures it. We're not told how long, and shortly thereafter, what is nursed in the heart springs forth in the life. And his brother lies dead in a field. Guard your heart. Pay attention to those twinges that let you know you are not rightly related with somebody. This is God's way of reminding you, hey, it's time to do something about this. And becoming aware of that, I think, is the first step. It leads to number 2, which is so simple to say and so incredibly difficult for you and for me to live out. And it's this. You and I actually need to be willing to reconcile. And you and I need to feel that sense of urgency to do this. It's interesting to me that both examples that Jesus uses suggest that it has come to our attention that somebody else has a grievance with us. But let me just, I'm not trying to say the other wouldn't also be appropriate, but just hear this for a minute. What Jesus doesn't say is, if you're worshiping and having a great time and it suddenly comes to your mind that you have an issue with somebody, is actually not what he says. If you're worshiping and it comes to your attention that somebody has a grievance against you, do you know why we never feel any urgency to have to respond to those kind of situations? Because it bounces around in our head and our heart, and here's what comes out. That's their problem. Honestly, this is what we say. This is not my problem. It's their problem. Jesus says, no, it's yours. Why? Because you and I are on the hook for our own behavior. And Jesus, I'll talk about this in a minute. Number 1 issue with this, I am convinced, is pride. You and I do not like to lay our weapons down when it comes to seeking reconciliation. And this can be for a variety of reasons. What's not unusual is when it comes to our attention that somebody has a grievance against us, on one level you'll hear people justify what they did. And this is what usually comes out. I didn't say anything that wasn't true. If you ever hear that, that is the sound of justification. And it might have been true, but I'm going to suggest you are still on the hook for the way you said it, which clearly was not well received. Second issue for why we struggle with this, because sometimes the grievance wasn't intended. It involves a misinterpretation on the other's part. I will not give specific examples, but I've been married for over 24 years. Those of you that have been married know what this is like. It is not unusual to come home and one spouse says something to the other. There's nothing intended behind it, but maybe our words weren't chosen carefully. Maybe the person on the receiving end was having a bad day, but there's a negative filter that it bounces through and is hurt in, and wounding and grievance happens. And it wasn't intended. Is this an opportunity to say, well, if you were a little less negatively oriented, you would have given me the benefit of the doubt? I have yet to ever find that to be a helpful thing to say. Ever. That is a recipe for sleeping in the garage. Or for there to be a homicide shortly thereafter. We tend to get this right more often than not in our marriages. I have seen people not willing to do this, though, with others. It's their fault for misinterpreting what I said. And that pride, is tough to do. Third reason why I think it's so hard is because when it comes to grievance, oftentimes the feeling is somewhat mutual. There's been a little bit of grievance that's on both sides. And so here's what happens. I'm not saying I'm sorry until they say I'm sorry. I'm not owning my behavior until they first acknowledge what they did to me. Let me ask you a trick question. James, stand up. Sheldon, stand up. I'll be quick. If there is an issue between these two and it is mutually held, and James says, I'm not saying sorry until you say I'm sorry, and Sheldon digs his heels in and says, I'm not owning my stuff until you own your stuff, when is this going to get resolved? Thank you. Sit down. You guys can hug each other later, make sure everybody thinks things are good. We somehow don't do the mental process with this. If you follow that trajectory, there's never any reconciliation that happens, ever, until somebody takes the initiative. I call this the relational game of chicken. You familiar with that game? By the way, don't ever play this. But this is like when kids would get on their bicycles and pedal like as fast as they can towards each other, and whoever's the first one to actually fear for their life and limb and veer off is the chicken. I guess you both win if that happens. And I say that because this is precisely what we do in relationships. I'm not giving until they give. I'm not giving in until they give in. This is what we have. Jesus says you be the chicken. You take the initiative. Get off your high horse, park your pride, have a slice of humble pie with your pumpkin pie, whatever you need to do, take the initiative to make things right. And for some of you, that'll be your piece this week. Oh, here's my disclaimer that I wanted to say. You and I need to feel the urgency of this. I will suggest, and I don't think the analogy that Jesus gives should be forced so literally, that we don't ever say, it may be appropriate sometimes to pause and just ask, what's the right way for me to go about this, and what's the right time? I don't think this should be read so rigidly that there isn't a moment to go, we want to still do this carefully. Reconciliation is a sensitive thing. But our tendency is to not do today what we can put off until tomorrow. And so it just draws out. And the longer this waits, the more damage is done to the relationship and the more resentment and festering happens in our hearts and lives. Jesus says you and I need to feel that urgency. Let me leave you with one last idea here, and here's where I get to kind of flip the switch to a positive sense. Some of you need to think about taking steps to be reconciled with somebody, perhaps, in the week ahead. But this is the nature of rules and laws in general. They're generally worded negatively. Don't drive faster than 30 kilometers an hour. But the heartbeat behind the rule usually has a positive piece. And the heartbeat behind this particular command, do not murder, is the thriving well-being of relationships. So if you aren't feeling any poking and prodding in your heart that says, man, I think I'm rightly related to those, then let me just ask and suggest to you, what can you do in the coming week that nurtures and builds up and encourages the relationships that are around you? I think this is living into the positive aspect of a negative command. How can you honor your spouse? How can you pray for your kids? How can you bless your classmates or your coworkers? How can you make room for those on the margins or come alongside practically someone who is hurting? What does it look like to step into this kind of an intent and a heartbeat? And here's where I will invite the music team to join me and those who are serving communion to also come forward. Here's why I think this is appropriate for us to talk about on a Thanksgiving Sunday. Because as we gather around this table, we remember and we reenact a bit of a story. And it is the story of a relationship that was horribly not rightly related, horribly fractured between sinful, rebellious, proud, stubborn people and a holy God. And this is the story of the one who didn't wait for us to take the first step to make things right, but instead took the initiative, if you read it through the lens of Philippians 2, took the humble posture and came to, so that opportunity could be had for you and I to experience right relationship. We are confronted as we participate with the horrible, sobering consequences of our sin. We talked about those increased penalties and punishments even in the passage we looked at. It was going to involve a broken body and spilled blood. And this is the beautiful thing about the cross, friends. Every time we look at it, we are confronted both with how serious our sin is and somehow how jaw-dropping God's love is for us. And we hold those two pieces together in tension. As we participate today, let me encourage you not just to remember what Jesus did for us, although that is a very appropriate starting point. This is also an opportunity for us to invite his life and his love to continue to do that transformative work in our hearts, because you and I are not naturally merciful like this. I found myself thinking about that beatitude. But as we participate, we are reminded of the kind of mercy God has for us. And as we catch a glimpse of the kind of mercy we have received, perhaps we will also be strengthened to be the kind of beatitude people who can consider extending this in undeserved ways to those around us. And this is also an opportunity, it seems, given the nature of what we talked about this morning, where we also pause and say, you also need to pause and consider if you are rightly related with God and rightly related with others before participating. There's a little bit of a sense that says, it's not saying you have to be perfect or sinless, none of us would ever participate. But if you are living in obstinate rebellion or in willful sin, you need to consider making that right between you and God before you participate. And I think the same would be true of fractured relationships, that there is an invitation that says before we consider that we're good with God, we are also encouraged to take those steps to make sure we are good with those around us. And so I invite you to consider that as we head in this direction. James, if you would,